peace internally in Ukraine can never be secure unless the violent right wing is disarmed and essentially neutralized. There is no country in the world where this kind of violent, disruptive, non-elected constituency can intervene in the political process. I mean, that's what the January 6th riots in the United States were all about. And they were labeled correctly, probably, as treasonous, as an attempt at a coup in this country. So after World War II, there were right-wing parties in many former Axis countries. And eventually, those were certainly deprived of the ability to arm themselves and eventually marginalized on the political spectrum, so that in order to push political parties toward the middle and establish a broader social consensus at the center. The weakness of Ukrainian society is that over the course of the last 30 years, no government has felt strong enough to contain its own violent extremists. And that issue cannot be put off indefinitely. The government has to deal with that directly at some point.
Yeah. The difference, I think, between the ultra right-wing nationalists of Ukraine and the January 6th insurrectionists in the US is that in the US case, they came without guns to the capital, right? Whereas in Ukraine, we know that they're armed. Are they today more or less armed than, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago? Because according to your analysis, the difference is huge.
Certainly more, because we know of organized groups that have joined or affiliated with the Ukrainian armed forces and been given guns. And there was also a time early on during the conflict that the government distributed small firearms and weapons to individual citizens, I'm sure a certain percentage of which were groups on the far right. They have, since the early 1990s, hoarded weapons stores and caches for themselves, because one of their objectives in the case of the government is the threat that if the government pursues policies that they consider, the right wing considers not to be in the Ukrainian national interest, they reserve unto themselves the right to overturn the government in the national interests of Ukraine. That has been a consistent policy statement since before 1991, when these groups were originally set up in the 1930s.
Jesus Christ, that reminds me so much of how the end of the Second World War went down in Japan, where at the very end, lower level officers wanted to overthrow the higher level generals because they said, if you want to surrender to the US, you're treasonous and we need to protect the emperor from himself, who just said that he wants to surrender. But that leaves a very, very important question open. I mean, even if Washington, Donald Trump, Moscow, Vladimir Putin, and Kiev, Mr. Zelensky, all of them agree, fine, let's stop this, let's surrender, or let's just finish it. Who would have the power to disarm these ultra right-wing nationalist groups that, if it came to this, would actually start a second civil war inside and try to just kill anything in the way? Who could disarm these people?
It would have to be the Ukrainian military, with the support of the Ukrainian government. And here we have an imponderable question to which we do not have the answer. Will the Ukrainian military stand with the elected government and validate its authority, or will it stand with the far right if groups on the far right make an effort to overturn the government in the interests of this kind of nationalistic vision of the country? I think this threat is not to be discarded, but is a very real one, potentially, if it is assessed that the peace negotiations are not providing Ukraine with a way to eventually recapture its territories, perhaps not immediately, but certainly down the road. And this is, of course, one of Russia's main demands. It wants a peace, not a ceasefire, a peace for the long term. And that is something that the nationalists have every interest in avoiding, especially for their own political future. If there is not a conflict, a permanent conflict with Russia, why would any average citizen thinking about the well-being of their family and their children and their children's children ever vote for perpetual confrontation and perpetual, essentially, impoverishment in a Ukraine that is on permanent war footing?
Do you think that Moscow and Washington, do you think that the appreciation for this political deadlock or the very real threat that Ukraine lacks the institutional coherence to surrender or to wind war footing down, that it's institutionally incapable of, right? It will break out into a form of another form of civil war and then continue. Is this appreciation there in Washington and Moscow or not?
I don't know. And I wouldn't say that it's a done deal. I mean, I think there is the risk there.
It might. Yeah, it might.
It might. And I suspect that there are ways in which Ukraine could be offered, the institutional government of Ukraine could be supported in its efforts should it choose to fight against extremist elements. But what I'm telling you and predicting with confidence is that this fight will take place. And I hope that the institutional government in Ukraine will succeed in taming and eventually not eradicating fully, but certainly minimizing the role of the militant far right to the levels that are considered tolerable in Western democracies. Right now, that is not the case in Ukraine.